I hope you will stay with me through this entire story and let me know what city you are watching from. I would love to see how far my experience reaches across the country. At 72 years old, after burying my beloved husband, Frank, just 18 months ago, I thought the hardest chapters of my life were behind me. I was Margaret Eleanor Thompson, a widow learning to navigate the world alone after 46 years of marriage. My son David had moved back home to help me manage the old Victorian house that had been in Frank's family for 3 generations, and I was grateful for his presence during those difficult months of adjustment. David was 35, a gentle soul who worked as an accountant at the local credit union. He had never married, always saying he was too busy taking care of me and the family property to think about settling down. Then he met Amber at a community fundraiser last spring, and everything changed. Amber Richardson was 26, a striking redhead with emerald eyes and a smile that could light up a room. She worked as a receptionist at the medical center downtown and had a way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the world when she spoke to them. David was completely smitten, and within 6 months they were engaged. I wanted to love her. I truly did. But something about Amber made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. Maybe it was the way she studied people when she thought they weren't looking, or how she always seemed to know exactly what to say to get what she wanted. There was a calculating quality beneath her charming exterior that reminded me of my late mother-in-law, a woman who had made my early married years quite difficult. The wedding was small but lovely, held in our backyard garden beneath the old maple tree where Frank and I had been married decades earlier. Amber looked radiant in her cream-colored dress, and David couldn't stop beaming. As I watched them exchange vows, I pushed aside my concerns and focused on my son's happiness. Perhaps I was just being an overprotective mother, reluctant to share him with another woman. After the wedding, they moved into the apartment above our detached garage, a cozy space that Frank had converted years ago when we thought we might need rental income. It seemed like the perfect arrangement, close enough that I could still see David regularly, but far enough that the newlyweds could have their privacy. At first, everything seemed wonderful. Amber was attentive and helpful, often joining me for afternoon tea and asking questions about family recipes and traditions. She expressed interest in the antique furniture and family heirlooms that filled our old house, and I was touched by her apparent desire to learn about our family history. But as the months passed, I began to notice small things that troubled me. Money started disappearing from my purse, never large amounts, just $20 or $30 here and there. When I mentioned it to David, he brushed off my concerns, suggesting that I was simply forgetting where I had spent the money. At my age, he said gently, it was natural to become a bit forgetful about such things. Then there were the phone calls. I would often hear Amber on her cell phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. She would explain that she was dealing with drama from old friends or problems at work, but her explanations always felt rehearsed somehow. The real changes started about 6 months after the wedding. David, who had always been responsible with money, began asking me for small loans. He needed help with car repairs, unexpected medical bills, emergency home repairs for the apartment. Each request was perfectly reasonable, and he always promised to pay me back quickly. But the repayments never came, and the requests became more frequent and for larger amounts. By last October, I had loaned him nearly $15,000 from my savings account, money that represented my security and independence. When I expressed concern about the mounting debt, David became defensive, insisting that he was going through a rough patch, but that everything would work out soon. Amber, meanwhile, had become increasingly comfortable treating my house as her own. She would let herself in using the spare key, rearrange my kitchen to suit her preferences, and even invite her friends over without asking permission. When I gently suggested that she should check with me first, she laughed and said that we were family now, and family didn't need to stand on ceremony. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday evening in November. I had been struggling with a particularly bad arthritis flare-up and had asked David to help me get some heavy boxes down from the attic. I needed to retrieve my winter clothes and some documents for my accountant. Instead of helping me himself, he sent Amber. She climbed up into the attic with surprising enthusiasm, spending nearly an hour up there instead of the few minutes it should have taken to locate the boxes I needed. When she finally came down, she had found exactly what I asked for. But I noticed she seemed flushed and excited, almost breathless with some kind of suppressed energy. That evening, while I was making dinner, Amber knocked on my kitchen door. She rarely visited in the evenings, preferring to spend that time with David, so I was surprised to see her. "Margaret," she said, her voice unusually formal, "I need to speak with you about something important." She sat down at my kitchen table without waiting for an invitation, her hands folded neatly in front of her, like a schoolgirl preparing to recite a lesson. "Of course, dear," I said, though something in her manner made me nervous. "Is everything all right?" She smiled. But it wasn't her usual warm expression. This smile was sharper somehow, more predatory. "Actually, everything is better than all right. I have wonderful news to share with you." I waited, sensing that whatever she was about to tell me would be anything but wonderful from my perspective. "I am pregnant," she announced, her eyes fixed intently on my face, as if she were studying my reaction. My first emotion was genuine joy. Despite my reservations about Amber, the thought of a grandchild made my heart leap. "Oh, sweetheart, that is marvelous news. Does David know?" "Not yet," she said, still watching me with that unsettling intensity. "I wanted to tell you first because this baby is going to change everything for our family. There are things you need to understand about the situation." Something cold settled in my stomach. "What kind of things?" Amber leaned forward across my kitchen table, her voice dropping to just above a whisper. "The baby isn't David's, Margaret. It is your husband's." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "My husband has been dead for 18 months, I said slowly. Her laugh was like ice cracking. "Not Frank, silly. Your new husband, Robert." I felt the world tilt around me. "Robert? I don't have a new husband. I don't know anyone named Robert." Amber's expression shifted from triumph to confusion, then back to calculation. "Oh," she said softly, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "You don't know about Robert yet, do you? Well, let me fill you in on what your precious son has been up to while you have been playing the grieving widow." What followed was the most surreal and terrifying conversation of my life. Amber explained, with chilling matter-of-fact delivery, that David had been living a double life for months. The money he had been borrowing from me wasn't for car repairs or medical bills. It was to pay gambling debts that had spiraled completely out of control. "He owes over $60,000 to people who don't accept excuses," she told me. "People who were starting to make threats about what happens to families when debts don't get paid." So David got creative with his solutions. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what she was telling me. Creative how? 3 months ago, David legally changed his name to Robert David Thompson and created an entirely new identity, complete with fake ID cards and social security numbers. Then he married me as Robert, not David. From a legal standpoint, I am not married to your son at all. I am married to a man named Robert who doesn't officially exist. The implications crashed over me like waves. But why? What does any of this accomplish? Insurance fraud, identity theft, marriage fraud, take your pick. Amber seemed almost cheerful as she explained the details. "My marriage to Robert makes me entitled to certain benefits and protections, and when this baby is born, Robert will be listed as the legal father on all the official documents." I stared at her, horror growing in my chest. "But David doesn't know about the baby not being his." "Oh, he knows the baby isn't his," she said with a cruel smile. "What he doesn't know is that I am not actually married to David Thompson. I am married to Robert Thompson, a legal ghost that his identity theft created. When everything comes out, David will face federal charges for fraud, and I will be the innocent victim who was deceived by a criminal." "The baby," I whispered. "Whose baby is it really?" "That is where things get interesting," she said, clearly enjoying my distress. The father is someone you know quite well. Actually, someone who has been helping me keep track of David's activities for months now. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photograph that made my blood run cold. It was our mail carrier, Thomas Chen, a quiet man in his early 40s who had been delivering to our neighborhood for several years. In the photo, he and Amber were embracing in what was clearly an intimate moment. Thomas has been keeping me informed about any unusual financial documents coming to your address, she explained. Bank statements, credit applications, legal notices, anything that might indicate David was trying new schemes to get money for his gambling habit. In return, I kept him company during his lunch breaks. I felt physically sick. You have been using him too. I have been using everyone, Margaret. That is how survival works when you are dealing with someone as desperate and dangerous as your son has become. The room seemed to spin around me. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, my son, was crumbling into dust. David isn't dangerous, I said weakly. He is a good boy who has made some mistakes. Amber laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Good boys don't steal their mother's social security checks. Good boys don't take out credit cards in their dead father's name. Good boys don't threaten to burn down the family home for insurance money when the gambling debts get too high. She was lying. She had to be lying. But even as I told myself that, memories started surfacing that I had pushed aside or rationalized away. The missing mail that David claimed must have been lost in delivery. The strange phone calls asking about Frank's estate. The life insurance forms that David said I needed to update, but that I had never actually seen completed. You are making this up, I said. But my voice sounded uncertain even to my own ears. Amber reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. Why don't you take a look at some evidence before you decide I am lying? The documents she spread across my kitchen table told a story that shattered my world completely. Credit card applications in Frank's name, dated months after his death. Bank account statements showing large cash withdrawals from my savings that I had never authorized. A life insurance claim that David had filed, listing himself as the sole beneficiary of a policy I didn't remember taking out. But the most devastating document was at the bottom of the pile. A legal petition that David had filed with the county court, requesting guardianship over my finances and medical decisions based on claims that I was suffering from severe dementia and could no longer manage my own affairs. In his sworn statement, David described incidents of confusion and memory loss that were either completely fabricated or gross exaggerations of normal senior moments. He claimed that I had been found wandering the neighborhood in my nightgown, that I had left the stove on for hours, that I had given thousands of dollars to telephone scammers. All lies, but lies that were carefully crafted to paint a picture of a woman who needed protection from her own failing mind. The guardianship hearing is scheduled for next month, Amber said, watching my face as I read through the devastating papers. Once David gains legal control over your finances, he will have access to everything. Your savings, your social security, the value of this house, your late husband's pension benefits, more than enough to pay off his gambling debts and start fresh. And where do you fit into this plan? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I am his insurance policy, she said simply. The loving daughter, in-law, who can testify about your declining mental state. The concerned family member who has witnessed your confusion and forgetfulness firsthand. My pregnancy makes me even more sympathetic. A young woman trying to protect her unborn child from an unstable grandmother. But it is all lies, I said desperately. Of course it is lies, she agreed cheerfully. But they are very convincing lies, supported by documentation and witness testimony. And once the court grants David guardianship, the lies become irrelevant. He will have complete legal authority over your life. I stared at the papers scattered across my table, trying to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. My own son, the child I had raised and loved and trusted, was planning to steal everything I had and lock me away based on fabricated evidence of mental incompetence. Why are you telling me this? I asked. If this plan benefits you, Why warn me? Amber smiled that cold, calculating smile again, because the plan changed when I got pregnant. You see, I was supposed to disappear after the guardianship hearing. Take a small payoff and vanish, leaving David to manage your affairs without interference. But now I have leverage of my own. What kind of leverage? The baby, she said, her hand moving to her still, flat stomach. David thinks this child is his, which means he will want to stay married to me, build a family, establish a normal life. But I know the baby belongs to Thomas, and I have DNA evidence to prove it. That gives me power over both men. My head was spinning trying to follow her logic. I don't understand what any of this has to do with me. Simple, she said, leaning back in her chair like she was settling in to watch a show. I am going to blackmail both of them. David will pay me to keep quiet about the baby's real parentage. And Thomas will pay me to keep quiet about his role in the mail fraud. But I need you alive and competent to make this work, because a dead or incompetent woman cannot be blackmailed. The full horror of my situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. I wasn't just a victim of my son's gambling addiction and desperation. I was a pawn in an elaborate game of manipulation and fraud involving multiple people who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. So what happens now? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the chaos in my mind. Now you are going to help me destroy your son's guardianship petition, she said matter of factly. You are going to provide evidence that you are completely mentally competent and that David has been lying about your condition. In return, I will make sure the gambling debts get paid without him having to steal your life savings. And if I refuse? Amber's smile turned genuinely vicious. If you refuse, I will testify at the guardianship hearing that your mental decline has been even worse than David described. I will say you have become paranoid and delusional, making wild accusations about family members trying to steal from you. The court will not only grant David guardianship, they will probably recommend immediate placement in a memory care facility. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of my son's betrayal and my daughter-in-law's manipulation, and realized that I had vastly underestimated both of them. I was trapped in a web of lies and legal fraud that had been months in the making, and my only ally was a woman who saw me as nothing more than a useful tool in her own schemes. But as I looked at Amber's confident, predatory expression, I felt something shift inside me. She had made one crucial mistake in her elaborate plans. She had underestimated me. At 72 years old, I had survived the death of my husband, raised a son as a single mother after Frank's heart attack, managed household finances for decades, and navigated the complex world of estate planning and legal documents that come with widowhood. I was not the helpless, confused old woman that everyone seemed to think I was. And I was about to prove it very well, I said calmly, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that seemed to surprise her. What exactly do you need me to do? As Amber outlined her plan, I nodded and asked appropriate questions, playing the role of the frightened, grateful old woman who was relieved to have someone looking out for her interests. But inside, I was already formulating a very different strategy. I had learned something valuable from this conversation. I wasn't the only one living with dangerous secrets. Amber had revealed her own vulnerabilities, the identity fraud, the relationship with Thomas, the pregnancy that could destroy multiple lives if the truth came out at the wrong time. She thought she held all the cards. But she was wrong. I had been playing games of strategy and survival long before she was born, and I had no intention of letting a manipulative child destroy everything I had worked for. The war for my life and independence was just beginning, and I intended to win. Over the next several days, I moved through my daily routines, like a woman sleepwalking. But inside, I was more alert and focused than I had been in months. I began to understand that my survival depended not just on proving my mental competence, but on gathering evidence of the extensive fraud that had been committed against me. The first step was confirming the details of what Amber had told me. I needed to see the actual court documents for myself, not just the copies she had shown me. On Thursday morning, I called a taxi and went to the county courthouse, telling David that I had errands to run in town. The clerk in the probate office was helpful and sympathetic when I explained that I wanted to review any guardianship petitions that might have been filed regarding my affairs. Within minutes, she had located David's filing, and I spent an hour reading through every page of his detailed request for legal authority over my life. The documentation was even more elaborate than Amber had indicated. David had obtained statements from 3 different doctors claiming that I had shown signs of cognitive decline during recent appointments. The problem was, I had never seen any of those doctors, and the appointments described in their reports had never taken place. He had also submitted testimony from neighbors reporting incidents of erratic behavior. Me leaving doors unlocked, forgetting to bring in my mail, having conversations with people who weren't there. Again, these were complete fabrications, but they were presented with such specific detail that they would be difficult to refute without contradictory evidence. Most disturbing of all, David had included bank records showing that I had been making large, unusual purchases and cash withdrawals that could indicate financial exploitation by scammers or an inability to manage money responsibly. These transactions were real, but they were the loans I had given to David himself, disguised to look like evidence of my own poor judgment. The complexity and thoroughness of the fraud was breathtaking. This wasn't a desperate son making impulsive decisions. This was a calculated, long-term plan to systematically strip me of my independence and assets. But as I read through the documents, I began to notice inconsistencies and details that could work in my favor. The medical reports contained errors about my health history that would be obvious to any doctor who actually examined me. The neighbor testimony described incidents that supposedly occurred on dates when I could prove I was elsewhere. And the financial records, while damning, could be explained if I could demonstrate that the money had gone to David rather than to scammers or fraudulent schemes. I left the courthouse with photocopies of everything and a clear understanding of what I needed to do. I had less than 3 weeks before the guardianship hearing, and I needed to build a case that would not only prove my competence, but expose the fraud that had been committed against me. My first call was to Dr. Patricia Williams, the physician who had been my primary care doctor for over a decade. I made an appointment for a complete physical and cognitive assessment, explaining that I wanted thorough documentation of my current health status for legal purposes. Dr. Williams was surprised by my request, but agreed to perform comprehensive testing. When I saw her 2 days later, she confirmed what I already knew, that I was in excellent health for my age, with no signs of dementia, cognitive decline, or any of the other conditions described in the fraudulent medical reports David had submitted. More importantly, she was appalled when I showed her copies of the fake medical documentation. "These reports claim to be from my colleagues," she said. Her face flushed with anger. "But none of these doctors have ever treated you, and some of these supposed diagnoses are completely inconsistent with your actual health history. This is a serious case of medical fraud." She immediately agreed to provide detailed written testimony refuting every medical claim in David's guardianship petition. And she also referred me to a neurologist who could perform additional cognitive testing to further document my mental competence. My next step was gathering evidence about the financial fraud. I spent hours going through bank statements, credit reports, and financial documents, creating a detailed timeline of every transaction that David had disguised as evidence of my incompetence. I also contacted the credit card companies and banks involved in the identity theft, using Frank's information, reporting the fraudulent accounts, and requesting documentation of how they had been opened. But the most important evidence came from an unexpected source. Thomas Chen, the mail carrier who had been involved with Amber, appeared at my door on the following Tuesday evening, looking nervous and guilty. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, wringing his hands anxiously, "I need to talk to you about something important. I think I have made a terrible mistake." I invited him in, offering coffee and trying to appear calm, despite my racing heart. Thomas was clearly struggling with his conscience, and I sensed that what he had to tell me could be crucial to my case. "Amber asked me to help her keep track of your mail," he began hesitantly. "She said David was worried about you and wanted to make sure you weren't being taken advantage by scam artists. It seemed like a reasonable request from family members who cared about your welfare. But as the weeks went by, Thomas explained, he began to realize that the information he was providing wasn't being used to protect me. It was being used to build a case against me. He had noticed that certain pieces of mail went missing after he reported them, and he had begun to suspect that David was intercepting documents that might contradict the story of my supposed competence. The breaking point came when Amber asked him to sign a statement swearing that he had observed me exhibiting confused and erratic behavior during his mail deliveries. The statement described specific incidents that Thomas knew had never occurred, and he realized that he was being asked to participate in perjury. "I cannot do this," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I know you are a good person, Mrs. Thompson, and what they are planning to do to you is wrong. I want to help you fight back." Thomas's testimony would be invaluable, but I knew that his relationship with Amber made him vulnerable to retaliation. I also suspected that there was more to his involvement than he was admitting. "Thomas," I said gently, "I appreciate your honesty, but I need to know everything if I am going to help both of us out of this situation. What exactly is your relationship with Amber?" His face crumpled with shame and regret. "She seduced me," he admitted. "I am married, Mrs. Thompson, with 2 young children. Amber knew that and used it against me. She said if I didn't help her with information about your mail, she would tell my wife about the affair and ruin my family. So the baby she is carrying, is it yours?" He nodded miserably. "She told me she was on birth control, but I think getting pregnant was part of her plan all along. Now she has even more leverage over me because the baby will be proof of my infidelity." I felt a surge of sympathy for Thomas, but also a growing sense of strategy. Amber's web of manipulation had made her powerful, but it had also created multiple points of vulnerability that could be exploited. "Thomas," I said carefully, "what if I told you there was a way to protect your family and help me at the same time? Would you be willing to work with me?" His eyes lit up with desperate hope. "Anything, Mrs. Thompson. I will do anything to make this right." What followed was the most complex and delicate operation I had ever undertaken. Working with Thomas, I began documenting every aspect of the fraud conspiracy, gathering evidence not just of David's guardianship scheme, but of Amber's manipulation, blackmail, and identity theft. Thomas provided me with copies of mail that had been intercepted, including bank statements and legal documents that David had prevented me from seeing. He also agreed to wear a recording device during his conversations with Amber, capturing her admissions of fraud and blackmail on tape. Most importantly, he helped me understand the full scope of David's gambling addiction and the dangerous people who were pressuring him for repayment. The debts were even larger than Amber had indicated, and the threats against our family were real and immediate. But knowing the extent of the danger also gave me a clearer picture of how to resolve the situation. David wasn't just a greedy son trying to steal from his mother. He was a desperate man who had been manipulated and exploited by a woman who saw his desperation as an opportunity for her own gain. 10 days before the guardianship hearing, I was ready to spring my trap. I had medical evidence of my competence, financial evidence of the fraud, witness testimony exposing the conspiracy, and recorded conversations proving Amber's blackmail schemes. But I also had something more important, a plan that would save my son while destroying the woman who had nearly destroyed us all. I invited David and Amber to dinner on a Sunday evening, telling them I wanted to discuss family finances before the court hearing. They agreed readily, probably expecting me to sign over my assets voluntarily to avoid the embarrassment of a public guardianship proceeding. They arrived at my house dressed formally, as if attending a business meeting rather than a family dinner. David looked haggard and nervous, while Amber appeared confident and slightly triumphant. She was showing now, her pregnancy visible beneath her fitted dress, and she kept touching her stomach in a gesture that seemed calculated to remind everyone of her delicate condition. "Margaret," David said as I served the roast I had spent all afternoon preparing, "I want you to know how much I appreciate you handling this situation maturely. I know the guardianship process seems scary, but it is really for your own protection." I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the confused, frightened old woman they expected me to be. Of course, dear. I trust your judgment completely. Amber was watching me carefully, perhaps sensing something different in my manner, but unable to identify exactly what had changed. You seem quite calm about everything, she said. I was worried you might be upset about the legal proceedings. At my age, I said mildly, you learn to accept that there are some decisions you cannot make for yourself anymore. Family has to step in when your mind starts to go. David flinched at the words, and I saw a flash of guilt cross his face. Despite everything he had done, I knew he still loved me, and the necessity of destroying my independence was causing him genuine pain. We ate in relative silence for several minutes, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, I stood up and walked to the sideboard where I had placed a manila folder before dinner. I do have a few questions about the guardianship petition, I said, returning to the table with the documents. Just some details I would like to understand better. I opened the folder and began laying out papers, watching as David and Amber recognized the court filings, bank statements, and medical reports that formed the foundation of their case against me. For instance, I said conversationally, I am curious about these medical reports from doctors I have never actually seen. Dr. Harrison claims I was diagnosed with moderate dementia during an appointment on the 15th of March. But according to my calendar, I was visiting my sister in Florida that entire week. David's face went pale, but Amber remained composed. Sometimes elderly people forget appointments, she said smoothly. Memory issues can make it difficult to keep track of when and where you have been. That is true. I agreed pleasantly, but it would be unusual for me to forget an appointment that never actually took place. Wouldn't it? I pulled out another document, Dr. Williams' comprehensive medical assessment, complete with cognitive testing results that clearly demonstrated my mental competence. This report is from my actual doctor, dated last week. As you can see, there is no evidence of dementia, memory loss, or any other cognitive impairment. The silence that followed was deafening. David stared at the medical report, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Amber's mask of composure finally began to crack, though she was still trying to maintain control of the situation. Margaret, she said carefully, one medical opinion doesn't necessarily contradict others. Dementia can be inconsistent, with good days and bad days. You are absolutely right, I said, pulling out another stack of papers. That is why I also obtained assessments from 2 other physicians, including a neurologist who specializes in cognitive disorders. All 3 doctors reached the same conclusion, that I am in excellent mental health for my age. But the medical fraud is just the beginning, I continued, my voice remaining calm and conversational despite the earthquake I was creating. I am also curious about these financial records that supposedly show my poor judgment with money. I laid out bank statements and transaction records, each one meticulously highlighted and annotated. According to David's petition, these large cash withdrawals are evidence that I am being exploited by scammers or making irrational financial decisions. But as you can see from my documentation, every single withdrawal corresponds to a loan I made to David at his specific request. David's face was now completely white, and his hands were trembling visibly. Mom, he whispered, I can explain. I am sure you can, I said gently. But first, let me share some other interesting documents I have discovered. This time I pulled out evidence of the identity fraud, credit applications in Frank's name, bank accounts opened after his death, and financial transactions that clearly constituted theft of a deceased person's identity. David's fingerprints were all over the paperwork, both literally and figuratively. Then came the evidence of mail fraud, documented through Thomas's cooperation, and including recordings of conversations where Amber explicitly discussed intercepting my correspondence to prevent me from discovering the extent of the financial crimes being committed against me. But the most devastating evidence was the recording I had made of my conversation with Amber when she first revealed the conspiracy to me. Her own voice, clear and unmistakable, admitting to fraud, blackmail, manipulation, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. By the time I finished laying out the evidence, the dining room table looked like a law enforcement incident room. David was crying openly, his face buried in his hands, while Amber sat frozen with a combination of rage and panic that was terrible to witness. "David," I said softly, my voice filled with the love and disappointment that only a mother can convey. "Why don't you tell me about the gambling?" The story that poured out of him was heartbreaking in its familiar desperation. It had started small, just occasional bets on sports games with friends from work, but as his losses mounted, he began betting larger amounts to try to recover his money, falling into the classic spiral that destroys so many lives. When the debts reached dangerous levels and threats began to be made against our family, David panicked. He borrowed from credit cards, took cash advances, exhausted his savings, and eventually began stealing from my accounts to make payments to increasingly violent creditors. "I tried to stop," he sobbed. "I wanted to get help. But they said they would hurt you if I didn't pay them back. They knew where we lived, knew your schedule, knew that you were alone during the day. I couldn't let them hurt you because of my stupidity. And that is when Amber came into the picture," I said, looking at my daughter-in-law with undisguised contempt. "She offered to help," David continued, his voice barely audible. "She said she knew ways to access money quickly, legal ways that wouldn't hurt anyone. She convinced me that the guardianship was temporary, just until we could get control of enough assets to pay off the debts and get me into treatment. But it wasn't temporary. Was it, Amber?" I asked, turning to face her directly. For the first time since I had known her, Amber's composure completely collapsed. Gone was the sweet, charming young woman who had won my son's heart. In her place was something cold and vicious, a predator who had been caught in her own trap. "You stupid old woman," she snarled, her voice filled with venomous hatred. "Do you have any idea what you have done? Those people David owes money to don't care about your evidence or your legal technicalities. They want their money. And if they don't get it, your precious family is going to suffer." I remained calm in the face of her fury, though my heart was pounding with fear and adrenaline. "You are right that this situation is dangerous," I said. "But I have a solution that doesn't involve stealing my life savings or destroying my independence." Both David and Amber stared at me in amazement. "A solution." I pulled out one final document from my folder, a cashier's check made out to David for $67,000, representing the exact amount of his gambling debts according to the financial records I had obtained through my investigation. "I am prepared to pay off your debts completely," I told my son. "In return, you are going to withdraw the guardianship petition, enter a residential gambling addiction treatment program, and submit to financial oversight while you recover. The house and property will be protected through a trust that prevents either of you from accessing my assets in the future." David stared at the check like it was a mirage. "Mom, where did you get this money?" "I have been widowed for 18 months, I said. "I have had time to adjust my finances, liquidate some investments, and prepare for exactly this kind of family emergency. I would have given you this money months ago if you had simply asked for help instead of trying to steal it through fraud." "But what about me?" Amber demanded, her voice shrill with panic. "What about our baby? What about our marriage?" I turned to look at her with the full weight of my 72 years of experience dealing with difficult people. "Your marriage is based on fraud and manipulation," I said calmly. "David is going to annul it as part of his recovery process. As for the baby, I think Thomas Chen would be very interested to know that he is going to be a father." Amber's face went white with shock. "How did you?" "I know everything, Amber. I know about the blackmail, the identity theft, the mail fraud, and the paternity of your child. I have evidence of all of it, and I have witnesses prepared to testify. Your choice now is simple. You can leave quietly and build an honest life somewhere else, or you can face federal charges for mail fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, and conspiracy." The transformation in her face was remarkable. The mask of sweet femininity finally fell away completely. revealing the calculating predator underneath. But even in her fury, she was smart enough to recognize that she had been outmaneuvered. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and threatening. "You think you have won, but there are consequences to humiliating people like me." I looked at her steadily, feeling no fear despite her implied threat. "I am 72 years old," I said. "I have buried a husband, raised a son, survived financial hardship, family illness, and personal loss that would break most people. Do you really think I am afraid of a 26-year-old con artist who got pregnant by mistake?" The silence that followed was absolute. Finally, Amber stood up, gathered her purse, and walked toward the door, without another word. She paused in the doorway, looking back at David with what might have been genuine regret. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I never meant for it to go this far." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the wreckage of her lies and the long process of rebuilding our family relationships. David's recovery was slow and difficult, but genuine. The residential treatment program I found for him was expensive, but effective, and he emerged after 90 days with a clear understanding of his addiction and the tools to manage it for the rest of his life. The annulment of his marriage to Amber was complicated by the identity fraud issues, but my lawyer was able to navigate the legal maze and dissolve the union without David facing criminal charges. The financial oversight I established included regular counseling, restricted access to credit, and mandatory participation in Gamblers Anonymous meetings. Most importantly, we rebuilt the trust between us. David's shame and guilt over what he had put me through was almost unbearable for him. But I worked patiently to help him understand that his addiction was an illness, not a moral failing, and that families support each other through illness. Amber disappeared from our lives as suddenly as she had entered them. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had moved across the country and was living with Thomas Chen's sister while she prepared for the baby's birth. Thomas had chosen to leave his family to be with her and their child, a decision I regretted but understood. 6 months after that terrible dinner, I received a single letter from Amber, postmarked from Oregon. Inside was a short note written in her elegant handwriting. "Margaret, you were right about everything. I am trying to build an honest life now, for my son's sake. Thank you for giving me the chance to start over. I hope someday David can forgive me for what I put him through." I never responded to the letter, but I kept it in my desk drawer as a reminder that even the most manipulative people are capable of change when they are forced to face the consequences of their actions. David eventually met and married a wonderful woman named Sarah, a social worker who understood addiction and recovery. Their relationship was built on honesty and mutual support. And when they had children of their own, I finally became the grandmother I had always dreamed of being. The legal reforms I initiated, based on my experience, led to stronger protections for elderly people facing fraudulent guardianship proceedings. My testimony before the state legislature helped pass new laws requiring independent medical assessments and stricter verification of evidence in competency hearings. But the most important outcome was the lesson I learned about my own strength and resilience. At an age when society expects women to become passive and dependent, I had fought back against an elaborate conspiracy and won. I had protected not only my own independence, but also saved my son from the consequences of his desperation and addiction. Sometimes people ask me if I regret not seeing through Amber's deception earlier, if I blame myself for the months of manipulation and fraud that nearly destroyed our family. The answer is always no. You cannot protect yourself against people who are willing to lie and manipulate without limits. But you can choose how to respond when their true nature is revealed. I chose to fight back with intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking rather than anger or revenge. I chose to save my son rather than destroy him, and to give his manipulator a chance at redemption rather than pursuing punishment. Those choices reflected the values that Frank and I had tried to live by throughout our marriage, and they resulted in outcomes that preserved our family's future. At 74 now, I live independently in the same Victorian house where this whole nightmare began. David visits regularly with his wife and children, and our relationship is stronger than it ever was before. We learn to communicate honestly about difficult topics, and we both understand that family loyalty sometimes requires tough love rather than blind support. I still think about Amber sometimes, wondering if she kept her promise to build an honest life for her son. I hope she did, because every child deserves a mother who chooses truth over manipulation, love over control, and integrity over temporary advantage. The experience taught me that age brings not just physical vulnerability, but also wisdom, patience, and strategic thinking that can be more powerful than youth and beauty. When people underestimate elderly women, they make themselves vulnerable to exactly the kind of quiet, determined resistance that saved my family. I share my story now because I know there are other families struggling with similar situations. Elderly parents being manipulated by desperate children, marriages built on deception, financial fraud disguised as family assistance. The signs are always there if you know how to look for them, and it is never too late to fight back if you are willing to be strategic rather than emotional in your response. But perhaps most importantly, I learned that forgiveness and accountability are not mutually exclusive. You can love someone while refusing to enable their destructive behavior. You can offer second chances while maintaining firm boundaries, and you can choose redemption over revenge while still insisting on consequences for harmful actions. Those are the lessons that matter most when you are trying to build a family legacy worth leaving behind. What would you do in my situation? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was manipulating you for their own gain? Let me know in the comments below where you are watching from, and share your thoughts about how families should handle addiction, fraud, and betrayal while still preserving love and loyalty. And don't forget to check out my other stories about family drama and survival. I promise they will surprise you with their twists and turns.